Hi there, my name's Ben Rollison and this is the quick start guide for 3D Extruder. For the full lowdown on 3D Extruder, you need to look at the HTML user guide. In this guide, I'm just going to take you through some of the basic functions for setting up a 3D extrude. I'm going to start right at the beginning, which is usually a pretty good place to start, and that means installation. Just take the JSX bin file that you downloaded and drop it in the scripts folder. Or better still, the script UI panels folder of your After Effects install. I'm on a Mac here, but the principle's just the same on a Windows PC. Then, after you've restarted After Effects, if you installed it in the script UI panels folder, it'll be available under the window menu. And if you installed it in the scripts folder, then you can get to it under File, Script. Now, the crucial thing to recognize about 3D Extruder is that it's a two-stage process. Stage 1 is to create the extrude from the script interface using some basic parameters. Stage 2 is to fine-tune the extrude from within the After Effects interface with all the visual feedback that allows you. A good way to get started is with one of the 10 presets. They all do different things. Again, you can find all the details in the HTML user guide. And some nice pictures too. I'm going to go for Glossy Hard because that's the one with all the bells and whistles. Once you've loaded the preset into the interface, you can change the settings around, of course. I'm just going to turn the extrude depth up a touch, and I'm going to turn tint down to 0. I'm not going to turn tint off because it actually helps with visualizing in edit mode, which we'll come to later. Now, because this is a quick guide and not a long guide, there's not time to go through the details of all the parameters. But there are little tooltips next to each one to help you along, and again, for the full details about what everything does, have a look in the HTML user guide. So, select the layer that you want to extrude, in this case, my layer. Hit extrude, and wait for it. A couple of seconds later, it all looks a bit more like 3D, and you have up to 4 layers where you used to have 1. What I'll refer to from now on as the main 3D extrude layer is the selected one. As you can see, it's called the same as my original layer with 3DX after the name. Actually, I'm going to rename the layer. You can rename all the layers and comps that 3D Extruder creates, but be careful. 3D Extruder doesn't like duplicate names, so don't give layers in a composition the same name, and make sure that the compositions themselves have unique names too. Incidentally, if you don't like these little markers, you can turn those off as a universal preference up here. Once you've made your extrude, you can treat it like any other After Effects 3D layer. You can rotate it, you can scale it, move it, change the anchor point, add keyframes, animate it, and so on. Right, before we get on with stage 2, let's have a little peek at the structure. In the project window, you can see it's created a folder with all the 3D extrude comps in it. Here's our main 3D extrude layer. You don't really have to worry about that one too much. That's where the layers get stacked, the engine room, so to speak. The side, front, and additive front are the different parts that make up that stack, and the base is the composition that contains the contents of your extrude. Inside the More folder is reflection stuff. We'll come to that later. Now, that all becomes a little bit clearer if we look in the old flowchart view. Let's come into Composition, Flowchart, expand these, and lay it out so we can see what's going on. Seriously, does anyone ever use the flowchart view? It's actually quite good for getting a handle on how 3D Extrude is bolted together, but otherwise I have to admit I can usually get by without it. So, as you can see, we have our base comp. This contains the original layer that you extruded. That feeds into these 3 comps, the front, the side, and the additive front, if you used it. Those in turn feed into my layer 3DX, where the flat layers are stacked, the engine room. We're glad to know it's there and all functioning properly, although we don't necessarily want to pay it a visit. And all of that feeds into main comp, the comp where you ran 3D Extruder. So you can see any changes here in base will get propagated right down through the structure. And again, these three comps up here are the reflection comps. Now I have this folder here with a composition called stripes in it that I'm going to drop into front comp. I'm going to make sure that it's underneath the front bevel layer and set the preserve transparency. A quick look back in the main comp and you can see that there's just stripes on the front. Okay, let's cut that layer and put it into the sides comp. Yep, now I've got stripes on the side. Magic. And of course, if I cut and paste the stripes into the base comp, back in the main comp, there's stripes on both. So you can see how the structure works. Right, let's just get rid of that a second. Now, I mentioned before that using 3D Extruder is a two-stage process. And what we did before, setting up the extrude, is stage 1. Stage 2 is all about refining what you created using the controllers, which will either be on the controller layer or on the main extrude layer, depending on whether you had this little fella checked when you kicked off. I'm not going to show you all of these controllers, again for speed. For the full detail, as ever, have a look in the HTML user guide. I'm just going to put a little rotational movement on my extrude, say over 100 frames, with a nice little cushion at the end. And let's add a little camera move in. So let's create a one node camera, and then over the 100 frames we'll just bring it in a little bit, like that, just so it doesn't feel static. Now you'll have noticed that everything's a bit clunky once you've got an extrude going on. So first up, to preview my animation, I'm just going to switch into edit mode, which makes everything go much faster. You can see that in edit mode we go back to one single flat layer. Let's take a look. Cool. But it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to perceive the depth. That's why there's Edit Mode 2, which is a different way of visualizing. Let's just preview that. Basically, it uses 3 layers instead of 1, with the back 2 tinted to the tint color to give you a basic impression of the 3D depth. That's why I left tint on before, incidentally. There we go. Edit Mode 2 is also really handy if you want to adjust or animate the extrude depth, which is the next setting. Let's just up that to 75 or so. Transparency front and sides. It's worth a quick word on this one, although we're not going to use it here. You can extrude translucent things, but stacking layers tend to play havoc with translucency. 3D Extruder attempts to compensate, but you will probably have to come in and manually adjust these two parameters to get the translucency looking right in the extruded version, if you're extruding something translucent. Now, you've probably noticed that there's a light. What's that for? Well, both shading and beveling are controlled by the position of the light with relation to the extrude. That means the shading will change if you move or rotate the layer. Let's turn edit mode off for a second. Notice that the highlight is coming from the top right of the screen, because that's where the light is. Now, if I quickly flip the text upside down, then you can see that the highlight is still coming from the top right of the screen. Or alternatively, you can move the light. Let's just switch into 2 views Let's put Draft 3D on for a sec and turn our light on so we can see it but not light with it. And let's just pull the light down here and make a kind of ghoulish effect, lit from below. Better where it was though. How about left? Actually, let's do that with numbers. Sometimes it's better to do it with numbers because then the point of interest stays in the right place. And now the shading is coming from the left. We'll actually stick where we started out, but you get the general idea. Now, in this glossy hard setup, the sides don't react to light, which is usually a good way to do it because the side shading is faked. Think about it. It's not really solid sides, but a stack of front panels. That's why 3D Extrude needs to fake the lighting to make it look real. But the front does react to After Effects lights. If I turn Draft 3D off so we can see the lighting and go to frame 0 here, you can see the problem. So I'm going to balance that out by adding an ambient light to the scene, which will bring the lighting on the front up a bit to match the fake shading on the sides. And it also makes sure that the front doesn't turn completely black when it's facing away from the light source. You don't need to have the light on for it to create and control 3D Extrude's shading and beveling, but if you do turn it on, you'll get After Effects native lighting too. So with that in mind, let's just adjust the light parameters. We'll have an intensity of 120, cast shadows on, shadow darkness of say 40, and shadow diffusion of about 300. So it's just a gentle hint of shadow. Okay, looking good. Let's just zoom in and go into full res so we can have a play with the front bevel intensity. Let's go for 200 intensity. You can see what the depth does if I wham it up to 200. There, you can see the wider edge. But actually, let's stick around 80. And let's just balance out the side shading so it looks nice. That can go up to 100 intensity and the depth to 300. This setting actually has a bit of a non-intuitive effect on the sides. It actually does the same thing on each side layer as bevel depth. But when the layers are so closely stacked together, the effect is to make the side shading more intensive and smoother. It's actually quite a good way of smoothing things out if you can see the separate iterations to turn this up. So I think this is a good one to adjust by gut feeling. If you do need to smooth out raggedness on the edges, you can also smooth things out by upping the anti-aliasing a bit. Let's try 1. Don't go too far or it will start to look blurry. Youch. Well, I like the shading highlights, but the shadows are a little bit strong. So here's a neat trick. I'm just going to take this little shortcut through the engine room to emerge with oily shoes in the side comp. And I'm going to add a tritone effect to the side illumination layer. I'm going to set the middle one to mid-grey, RGB 127. Now check out the shading around here. As I pull the level up here, you can see it get lighter, but the highlights stay the same. Cool stuff, eh? I can even bring it up to be another highlight. And there you can see highlight all the way around. But actually, I think something around 40 should do. Okay, back to main comp. Now the bevel shadows are a bit dark. You could do the same trick with a tritone effect, but since the bevel shadows and highlights are already separated, I can just turn the bevel layer's opacity down in the front composition. And in the additive front, I'm going to soften the bevel with a little blur. And put one on the reflection layer, maybe too. And on the reflection matte. Basically, I'm just trying to show you that once you've created your extrude, you can actually go and work into these comps in a fairly normal After Effects way. Now for the reflection. I'm going to come into the reflection comp and replace the default softbox with this funky Kino flow pattern that I happen to have already. And you can see that that's reflected, quite literally, in the extrude. I'm just going to use center reflection to line up the reflection at the end point of the animation. Then I'm going to move the reflector around to line it up. For that, I'm going to turn on Draft 3D, zip into edit mode, but my reflection disappears. So I come down to Always Show Reflection to override that, and then I can line up to my heart's content. So let's spin it round, scale it up, and then move it up a bit too. I can put the reflection strength up a bit, and touch more distortion while I'm at it. Okay, out of edit mode, lights back on. It's actually a little bit distracting, the Kino flow pattern. So I'm just going to go back into the reflection comp and switch back to the default softbox pattern. It's just a little bit neater. So that's it. Now, let me just turn my secret strapline layer on. There we go. And let's preview that. Full screen, full res, HD. There's loads more that you can do with 3D Extruder, and I'm hoping to release some more tutorials in the near future with some cunning tips and tricks. But I hope for the time being that that gives you a good feel for what you can achieve with 3D Extruder. So, my name's Ben Rollison. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have fun with the script.